Welcome everyone who is tuning in. We're just gonna wait 1 minute while everyone enters the room virtually, has a virtual coffee, has a virtual chat with each other, and then we'll start virtually, but with a very real conversation. So I'm just gonna give it a few moments. See, we're being joined by Virginia Eubanks. What an honor. All right. I'll stop saying nice things about you, Virginia. Okay, I think people are starting to come in, so we should start today's conversation. So warm welcome to everyone who's tuning in for what is now already the 9th conversation in our Transforming State series on digital government and human rights. I should say at the outset that this conversation will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel and also on our webpage. And keep in mind, everyone, we'll have a Q&A portion after about 45 minutes. So please submit your questions throughout this talk via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Don't hold back, any question matters. Just to say that for each conversation in this series, my colleagues and I at the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project interview a human rights practitioner, academic or other expert on a specific case study of digital government and its implications for human rights for about an hour. And as those of you who've joined our earlier conversations will know, one of our aims with this series is to introduce a wider audience of human rights students, academics and practitioners, as well as other interested audiences to the implications of digital government for human rights. And that brings me to a second objective that we have with this conversation series, namely to inspire the formation of what we'd like to call a community of practice. People interested in the advent of the digital state and its consequences for human rights, especially for people who are marginalized. Now, through these conversations, but also through a blog series that we have written by students, academics and activists working on these issues, we hope to serve as a bit of a hub for interesting information and exchange on the rise of the digital state and human rights. Now, today we will talk about Colombia's pandemic payments and its reliance on data-driven technologies and prediction with our esteemed guest, Juan Lopez. And so let me hand it over to my colleague, Victoria Edelman, who is also, I should say, a driving force behind this conversation series.
Thank you very much, Christian, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Juan Lopez Solano is a historian and sociologist from Colombia. He's a research and policy officer at the Global Data Justice Project at Tilburg University Law School in the Netherlands. And he previously worked for Fundación Carisma, a Colombian NGO which works on human rights and digital technologies. While at Fundación Carisma, Juan undertook a research project into the Colombian government's system of possible social program beneficiaries, which is known as CISBEN, and we're going to be talking about that system today. Juan authored an excellent report about that system entitled Experimenting with Poverty, the CISBEN and Data Analytics Project in Colombia, and Christian has just shared a link in the chat to that report. Thank you. Now, more recently, the Colombian government launched a new scheme called Ingreso Solidario, meaning solidarity income, to provide social assistance payments to people during the pandemic. And this is really the main focus of today's conversation. Juan has been a leading voice within the debates surrounding the Ingreso Solidario, and he's argued that this scheme really represents a whole new approach to social policy. So we've got another link to one of Juan's pieces about that specifically in the chat, in case you are interested in reading more. And now today we're going to explore questions surrounding the Ingreso Solidario payments, and we'll discuss the new dynamics surrounding the big data-driven, private sector reliant and predictive approach to social assistance that this new scheme represents. But before getting into the specifics of Ingreso Solidario, Juan, I wonder if you could first of all give us a little bit of background about the historical context to this system of payments. So first, could you tell us what you perceive to be the main policy priorities and the sort of driving forces surrounding social assistance in Colombia? And then secondly, could you also tell us what systems were actually already in place before the Ingreso Solidario payments were introduced during the pandemic?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to be here. So to talk about the history of Ingreso Solidario and SISBEN, we also need to analyze like the series of reforms that took place in all over the world, and especially in Latin America during the 90s, promoted by the international organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, that they were interested in promoting a new way of doing social state, of doing social policy. So basically, the idea of targeting resources to the poorest of the poor, basically to try to target the resources and not to provide full benefits to all the population in the country. So basically, this idea that was promoted by these international organizations led to a series of reforms. This series of reforms depended on something fundamental, and is the idea of collecting personal data to target and to find this so-called real poor. So in this context, and especially after the reform of the healthcare system that needed to target populations to determine who should pay for the health system and who should not pay for the healthcare system, they decided to create a system for possible beneficiaries of social benefits. This system is basically it has two parts. Like the first part is like a system of information that has a series of personal data that is collected through massive interviews throughout the country. These interviews could take almost 4 years to update all the information that people is providing. And on the other hand, it has a model, a model of poverty, a profile, and a specific profile that leads to classify each household. So basically to determine who or which household is near to that profile of poverty. So basically what we have here is a social registry. It's full of information, it's full of personal data of the most vulnerable population in Colombia, and is also the door for, is the main door for social rights. So at least 19 social programs depend on the SISBEN classification. So basically, the classification is managed by one specific institution, and each institution that manages social benefits, you know, for example, cash transfers, will go to the classification of SISBEN to decide who should be eligible for that program. In the case of Ingreso Solidario, it's also fundamental to analyze how Latin America was part of a revolution in social policy at the beginning of the 2000s, and is the creation of the conditional cash transfer systems. Basically, the idea of of not giving services to people, just giving them like money, directly giving money to the poor, but though that money depended on specific conditions. So basically, generally in Latin America, we have cases in which they receive money in exchange to fulfill requirements or specific behaviors, like attending to school, the kids attending to school, like trainings, healthcare checks. So basically, this put a special pressure on women's because they are the main actor that receives the money, but the real beneficiary behind that is the child. The children, the kids are the main beneficiary, and this put a special pressure to the women, for the women to fulfill the requirements. I wanted to share something that we wrote about about that is in Spanish, if someone is here that understands Spanish. But that's something important also. So we have this kind of conditional transfers, and with this idea of moralizing the social benefits, basically to shape the behavior of the poor, no? And that's something really interesting, that exchanges the vision of social rights as something that is an entitlement, and more as something that is that you receive in exchange for something. So that's something that we need to take into account in the case of Ingreso Solidario.
Thank you very much, Juan. So that there's clearly a background here of an introduction of reforms that are really bringing in kind of conditionality, but also this targeting element where it's really trying to kind of find the very poorest and then basically reduce social programs to only really cover a smaller number. I want to kind of just ask a follow-up question about the interview process that you mentioned. This is presumably led by experts, and what kind of information are they looking for when they go and interview people to find these most vulnerable people? What sort of information would they look at and take down within that process?
They have a huge interview, a huge interview with hundreds of questions, but generally they collect information about health, about family composition, about access to social benefit, access to public services, finance information, also earnings, and different. So we have a lot of personal data related specifically to the personal life of each community. These interviews they take almost 4 years, because they went to areas where poverty has been located historically. And we took that almost in this moment in Colombia, we have almost 44% of the population in condition of poverty. And you also could ask for the interview. So for example, if I consider myself that I need an interview, I could ask for it. Mm-hmm. So this process could lead to a lot of time, and it's always the responsibility of the municipality to do that.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And I think background of this kind of more generally, and now to move on to the more specific pandemic payment system that we're talking about. As we mentioned, during the pandemic, the government launched this new program, the Ingreso Solidario, and this provides monthly payments to people who were not covered by any of the existing social programs, so the 19 programs that you mentioned that rely on CISBEN. The Ingreso Solidario was in addition, so people who also needed support from the government but weren't already covered by other programs. So in this Transformer States conversation series, we like to ask our guest speakers at the beginning about the positives and the promises that surround the digital government development that we're talking about. So in what ways might the Ingreso Solidario, in your opinion, represent a promising development in social policy? So from a human rights perspective in particular, how might we praise the ways in which technologies and big data were used within this specific scheme?
So I think that the way in which Ingreso Solidario was implemented was problematic, but the idea of having an expansion of social rights. So basically, because the pandemic crisis, we had this crisis, they needed to send more money to more people. So basically, they decided that they should send to another 2.9 million people social assistance. So that's a huge expansion of the social benefits in Colombia. Something good also is that, as I said, the problem of the conditionalities on cash transfers is that generally leads to more problems for the women in the house, like having the responsibilities to care for the kids and for care for the conditionalities. So that's also a good way, a good development in that way, and it's something that we need more, definitely. A system that don't depend on conditionality and more on entitlements. And the other thing is that the delivery was really fast. They don't depend on really long and slow processes to receive the money. So some people even receive the money immediately to their bank accounts, or in the case of they didn't have bank accounts, they received a text message to open a bank account and receive the money. That's something that it's necessary to have a more humane social protection system.
Just wanted to follow up on that, Juan. So the deployment of these payments to millions of people, in some cases, as you said, almost instantly, is certainly an impressive feat here. And we imagine that the speed at which this would be able to take place was facilitated by certain technological developments and data analytics capabilities that were developed earlier. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the technology-driven changes that had already taken place before the pandemic hit to facilitate the speed at which this happened. So in other words, in what ways was Ingreso Solidario building upon earlier programs?
So basically, this, as I said, SysBen, this system is managed by a unique institution. The institution is called the National Development Office, and is in charge of SysBen. But it's also in charge of the systems of the policies on big data and artificial intelligence. So they are this kind of institution that is really excited about using data to do and to solve whatever problem they have. So in 2016, they reformed, they modernized the SysBen. Basically, they were arguing that that a lot of people could access to social benefits, and that's a problem because, you know, Colombia has don't have a lot of money, so they needed to reform the system to basically really target and really find this real poor that we were talking about. So basically that meant two changes, and the two changes that are fundamental to understand how Ingreso Solidario was created. And so the first change is that they, as I say, they changed the algorithm, the model that was used to determine who is poor and who is not poor, the profile. So they decided to change that from access to social to access to services as proxies of my condition. So basically, if I have water, if I have sanitation, so if I have had those benefits, so probably I'm not poor. So they changed that, and they decided to collect information on education, health, employment, to create like a profile of income generation capacity. So basically, like what is earning someone that is in a specific profile. No, I have a bachelor's degree with this kind of family and this kind of health situation. So I probably will be earning this amount of money. So what they do is that they use that model to classify other persons or other social situations. So that's something really important, that they are trying to predict the situation of each household, and especially the income capacity. And the other thing is that they decided to cross-check the information that people were providing in the interviews. So basically, they decided to create agreements with 34 public and private databases. Those private databases included Experian, Colombia, that is a financial risk company, and TransUnion also, that is the other financial risk company. So they use all this data to find inconsistencies between the information that people provide and the databases. This could lead even to people being excluded from social benefits. So that's something really important. But what I want to connect everything with Ingreso Solidario is that all these agreements, all these databases made possible to create a unique list of beneficiaries in a short amount of time, you know, because they excluded people using all these databases to say that the the communities, the population that needed social benefits in this situation was 2.9 million. So basically, they use all these monster database that they were creating through all those registries to exclude people and to select specifically like 2.9 million. And well, we will discuss that after a while maybe, but the thing is that that it's important to understand that all these developments were used to do that and to target to almost 17. It is almost 17% of the population, the people that is receiving would receive that money.
You explained that this is a shift, but just to clarify, in many ways, as you started off in this conversation, it's also a continuation, right? Because if the main concern is that you want to target benefits, then this is mainly about getting better at targeting, getting more efficient at targeting. It's not so much a policy shift, and it's a continuation by different means.
Yeah, definitely. The idea is also I think that Ingreso Solidario is also different in a way, because as you said, so the idea of charity, almost like the people is not receiving money because it's an entitlement, but rather because they deserve that. So that is a mindset that and targetizing. Those are two mindsets that were really there. Yeah. But there is definitely a change in the situation. So, for example, the idea of not using the surveys and the interviews to basically try to target people, that's definitely a change. So basically, they decided to select beneficiaries using all the data that they had available, and not trying to find the people, that is in poverty. So that's a fundamental change of this the situation of going to a field, trying to find all the people that is in poverty. So so basically that's one fundamental change, and the other one is that basically all the people that was beneficiary, they were removed from this the political discussion. So because they basically the government closely, secretly decided who will be beneficiary of Ingreso Solidario, and they basically selected people and sent money. But there was no possibility to challenge that. There was no possibility to ask for transparency, to participate, for for accountability. And definitely the other thing is that definitely the way in which was delivered Ingreso Solidario, it really felt like lottery. It really felt like a gift rather than an entitlement. People was literally they didn't know that. They didn't know the databases that they used. They didn't know how that was possible, and then they received like a message. And there are cases in which they even receive messages saying like the municipality is sending you this amount of money, or these kind of things, that it really, I think, it's something more in the design, that it makes feel people that they are not receiving an entitlement in a so difficult situation, but rather a kind of charity, or they win something.
Absolutely. Just one thing I want to pick up on is a shift that happened here with Ingreso Solidario that you've already talked about a little bit, is the shift from the surveys to a more predictive approach to seeing what people's income or income generating capacity is. And that seems to be a fundamental move from looking at what people actually have and their living conditions in reality to what could a family earn, what could they potentially have. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what exactly changes when you shift from an approach that is focusing very much on surveys and realities to an approach that focuses more on what could have been or what could be in the future. I mean, on to prediction.
So basically that something that is fundamental that we are losing is the idea of having political discussion and working with the community. No, this kind of feeling in which the government is trying to control everything from the distance is really making a huge gap between the person that is in poverty, that is entitled, that it needs help from it needs their social rights fulfilled. And then we have this kind of system that is completely apart, automated, that is deciding who will be eligible for something. So this really means that people is losing their capability to discuss, to negotiate. And in that way, it's generating less discussion, less friction, and it's in a way is perpetuating this distance between the government and the people. So in a way, it's also, I don't know, to take out the politics from the situation. No, the social rights are something that is political, and the claims of the communities there are something political that that through those systems they could avoid to have the political discussions about who should be eligible, and working with communities, and also in a way destroy community networks of helping themselves, and providing care and providing political solutions. So basically, this is a completely top-down idea.
And sorry, Juan, just to follow up on that. So if this is really about a top-down approach that takes out sort of the contestation that might normally happen, the capacity for self-help, do you think that those are perceived at the government level as political benefits? Do you think it's intentional? Or do you think this was just sort of a happy side effect from the perspective of the government of moving towards a system like this? To what extent do you think that there was a real intention here?
I think it's intentional. I think definitely it's intentional. It's something that is, as I said, it's something that it is constructed from before. So it's really that it's a process that they have been trying to do. You know, the idea of not going to the field and collect information was from 2018, but they used the pandemic as a way to basically implement something that they were not able of doing before. So that mindset of avoiding political discussion is clearly a part of the idea of Ingreso Solidario, and in general, the whole social policy in Colombia. So basically, they were trying to not have these political discussions. And if you see the historical developments of CISBEN and all those systems, they really try to render technical, you know, to create this idea of this technicality, super complex decision system that avoids that avoids to have these discussions and to have alternative ways to target social benefits.
See what you mean. Just it strikes me that the speed at which this has been implemented, we just talked about, may not just be a function then of the technological affordances here of the system, but also of a politics, where when you talk about the opportunity that was perceived here in the pandemic, and so the speed at which the developments happened might be a function of that as well, if I hear you correctly.
Yeah, for sure. I remember in that moment they have other options to select people, you know, because there are other databases. For example, the healthcare database. It's really clear who is depending on subsidized healthcare and who is not depending on that. That's really simple. But they decided to go for the high-tech data option of using 34 databases and mixing them all together. So that in a way shows that that it obviously sending money to people was important, because it was something that people was claiming in the streets, that people was protesting and asking. So it was a way to maintain the situation in control, or at least legitimate the situation. But definitely it was also something of showing their capabilities, using all the data, all the systems that they were doing. And they changed, they created a law decree that allowed them to use all that data that they use. So it was an opportunity that they took.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I want to pick up on that point that you made about, the increasing complexity here, really serving to obfuscate the political choices and the policy approaches that are happening here. And I want to kind of pick up on those kinds of questions to ask you about your methodologies when you're kind of doing your research in this area. Because I think it's really important to explore not only what's happening when governments bring these kinds of new approaches, technologies, and analytical tools into their ways of working and how that kind of impacts people, but also, it's important to think about the implications of those kinds of trends and developments for the human rights fields and for practice. So I wonder if you could tell us what kinds of methods you adopted when you were researching the Ingreso Solidario, and the kinds of challenges that you faced in doing so. And also just a reminder to our audience to send in questions via the Q&A as well while we have our conversation. Thank you.
As I said, we were working in this situation since 2019, so it was before the pandemic. We're trying to analyze Isben, and the idea was to challenge the idea of how the data systems and privacy is being analyzed. So we were trying to focus on something that was more real, and also with something that wasn't so high tech, like if we think in the use of data on systems, we think in this artificial intelligence huge thing, and we were interested in analyzing that, something that was simpler, something that it really had impact on lives of people. So then we decided to go for Sysben, and we were in 2019 following that. So we start to do discourse analysis, to collect a lot of information, and then when we end up without information, we ask for a freedom of information request to ask for more information. But then there is a moment in which you end up in a closed door, in which some things were completely secret. So for example, the algorithm, the way in which they profile people, what is this profile of being in poverty, is something that is secret. So you cannot access that information. And the reason that the government gives is that this could lead to macroeconomic crisis, because they say that the people could use that. And this is something so important to analyze, the discursive ideas that they have about the people in poverty. And this, that they think that the people know how the system works, they will try to hack it and collect all the money and ask for benefits. So that's the reason why they have this secrecy about the algorithm, secrecy about many documents that we asked for, because they say that, for example, they use for example, their relationships with some private actors are secret because they are private actors and you cannot ask for public information from them. So they really dilute or hide this information through a complete lack of clear responsibilities. So that was something that make it really difficult. And the other thing is that cisben is something that has been really naturalized, something that people think as natural. And the expertise is something that it appeared to be natural. No, this discussion about cismen needs to happen in economic terms, in data terms, in really expertise kind of way. But we realize that it's a really political system that has not been criticized properly, and is completely natural. It's even part of the discussion in Colombia. It's even part of an stigma in Colombia being inside that database. So people is really talking about it, and they really think that is something that is natural to receive benefits through that way. And I think if we consider this global audience, we know that is not natural. It's not the way in which everything should be in social policy, but it's something that is really naturalized. So trying to discuss that is really, really difficult, and trying to challenge the system in that way is really, really difficult. So, and the other thing is obviously the pandemic made impossible to go to the field, to analyze the situation of some populations, and especially during the pandemic.
Thanks very much. I think kind of talking about how people were thinking about this and how it's been naturalized is a really helpful segue, because of course we're approaching this from a human rights perspective, and what we're really interested in hearing about as well is really how people were affected by this. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, whether this ingreso solidario system really worked on its own terms, and you know how whether it achieved its aims, and what the impact on people who received or did not receive the payments has been in Colombia.
I think that is clear that ingreso solidario didn't work, because, or at least it didn't fulfill the basic needs of the Colombian population, because just in 2020, 3.5 million people fell into poverty. So that's a really important figure. And that shows that the efforts of the state were not enough. So, for example, when they showed this number of the 3.5 million that fell into poverty, they said, but if in this kind of prediction way, if we were not using ingreso solidario, maybe it could be 6. So that's something really, really important. No, the naturalization, the making like normal, thinking that people, 3.5 million people is falling into poverty, like making acceptable politically that people is going through the violence of poverty. So that's something that it shows definitely that the ingreso solidario was not enough, and the way in which was implemented, it wasn't enough. And the other thing is that it's a continuation of a trend that we were talking about, this arbitrary decision making that generally could lead, and this ethos of this idea of using a lot of data and connecting 34 databases definitely could lead to failures that were affecting directly people and leaving them outside of the system of the entitlements. So, for example, as I say that they use all these databases to cut, to exclude people, if people was I don't know, earning more than I don't know, $900 or $500 before the pandemic, so they are excluded. So, for example, they start to use all these databases to exclude people, and this on one clear inconsistency was that almost 17,000 people was included in the benefits, but they didn't exist, so they were not in the national registry. It is not as big, but the important thing is that it is something that is really clear. Go to an identification number and find if it exists. That is one database. It was 35. So we don't know the possible impacts of that. And the other thing is that this definitely translates into more data to solve that problem. So for example, when they had these 17,000 inconsistencies, they decided, okay, we need to check again. And so we will go for the data of the the Forensic Institute, and then go to the data of the prisons. So the idea was to use whatever data possible to try to solve that so-called that problem. So basically, I would say that those could be the more the clear impacts of Ingreso Solidario. And I have something also that is a lot of the cash transfers were not collected because people because that is another way of exclusion, that is that the government suppose that everyone has a cell phone. So some people never collect the money because they didn't have possibilities to know that they were selected, you know. So in this moment, we have people that have not collected their entitlements. So that's something that we should also consider.
Absolutely. So there was also a change in the kind of delivery method of the payments as well, with basically electronic transfers and the use of mobile money, which leads to further exclusion, as we know from a lot of other contexts. And I think that point about the arbitrariness here, where despite the best efforts of kind of turning to another database and another database and doing as much cross-checking as possible, there was still, as you've identified in a lot of your work, there were still faults in the data. And so you will end up having quite arbitrary situations. And that kind of links to what you were saying about the lottery point, where of course it's not a lottery, but it kind of makes it kind of feels that way for someone who perhaps is in much more dire need than someone they know down the road, but they appear differently and they're represented in databases differently. And then it can lead to that kind of these differences and feeling like these aren't entitlements. This is just a gift that this person was lucky to get and I wasn't lucky to get it, or that kind of thing. And I wonder if you could just tell us about what that shift from a notion of entitlements and rights that you were talking about to this more kind of arbitrary and perhaps even luck-based system. What does that mean, and why is that significant? And what's the role of rights here in kind of within this area?
I think the general situation is that all the secrecy and the lack of accountability of the system generated a promotion of the arbitrariness and the structural violence against people in poverty. So it means that the way trying to negotiate it was almost impossible, and this also generates an stigma on people, definitely, that they think that people is trying to hack the system always, that they are not like receiving social rights, and that's definitely affecting the lives of people. So basically all the lack of social rights is definitely affecting other rights of people, no? And this is important, that the social rights could not be divided into with other rights, no? They think that just sending money is enough, but the way in which these systems are being implemented is definitely affecting the dignification of people, the way, the possibility to participate in society. So that's something that is really important. And right now they didn't, like, they continue to send the money to these 2.9 million people, but people was not able of asking to be included, no? So we have a lot of courts, we have a lot of lawsuits of people asking to be included in Ingreso Solidario because they were not clear. They didn't include people. So people is asking for being included, and we have a lot of these situations, and it's important to consider that because people in conditional poverty has a definitely lack of access to justice, no? So the only option in this moment is to go to courts and try to ask for an amparo action to be included in that system. So that's something that really affect the situation. So what we are trying to do is try to help to redesign these kind of systems. Is necessary to rethink the way in which social systems are being implemented. That is something really, really important, because we are really comfortable talking about principles, talking about abstract decisions, but not like going and trying to analyze the implementation of those systems. So it could be that Ingreso Solidario is good because another 2.9 million is receiving money, but it is not something. It is not enough. It is something about how we implement those systems, and that means that we need to go from this politics of representation, of trying to represent the poverty, and going through experts of the World Bank to decide what is poverty, and go to the communities, work with the communities. So basically, we in this moment we are trying to take the fundamental rights as guidance to redesign the system. And we really need to think step by step in this system and really make it like being centered in the particular implementation of systems, and not on those abstract ways of thinking in social and political rights.
Thank you, Juan. And these are very relevant, very relevant points that you make at the end about the importance of redesigning using the principles of human rights. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and so I want to go through them in an organized way. So I'll combine a few that are related. So first, Alexandra Barantes, who's at Development Pathways, she writes, in terms of the need by government to constantly determine deservingness for poor relief programs versus assuming entitlements and the right to social protection, what do you think is the origin or the reason for what I call this willful blindness in technocratic tools such as poverty targeting and the use of technological systems in the case of Colombia? And Usha Ramanathan, who's tuning in from India, she asks a similar question. Do you see similar patterns in other parts of your continent? Who's creating the imagination for this agenda as you see it in Colombia? And then a third question, I hope I'm not overloading you with questions, Juan, is also from India, from Ritika Kira, who's of course written hugely influential works on the Aadhaar system in India. She says, apart from the philosophical issue with the approach that was used, which were the previous two questions were of more philosophical nature, how confidently can it be said that this approach did not have exclusion errors? You addressed it to some extent, of course. That the she writes monster database. I think she means master database. It's a funny error there. Combined with the exclusion criteria that were used were adequate to find everyone who needed support, that the data set included everyone, was complete, recorded people's actual information correctly. And she's asking that specifically from an Indian perspective, where all of these were serious issues.
Ooh, the last one was long. Okay, about the origin of these mindsets, I think definitely what we were discussing is something really important, and is this idea of targeting and avoiding people to participate in their rights is something fundamental. No, this technocracy to avoid to have political discussions about people in poverty, and in the Colombian case excluded, part of being targets of violence, physical violence, symbolical violence. So I think it's a way, definitely, it's something that it comes from this technocratic way of avoiding that. And the World Bank in that way is really a fundamental actor on that. So in this imagination agenda, I think that is really important. I have been analyzing documents from the World Bank and recommendations on social policy, and I have noticed that it's something that is really part of the idea of a lot of international organizations to really try to be more exact, be more precise on the targeting. So they are thinking on collecting even more and more data, no, location data, patterns of consumption. So it is something that is being promoted, and is also connected to another part, and is also to create this notion of citizenship that is completely connected with financialization. So being subject of debt, it means being a citizen, no? And the only way that they could that they create this idea that the only way to be included in citizenship is through debt, no? And being a subject of these predatory practices that we have been seeing all over the world. The cases like Ingreso Solidario, I don't know too much in Latin America, but I know that cases like that were implemented in Togo, were implemented in Pakistan. So that mindset is not just Colombian. It is functional for the Colombian politicians and these kind of institutions to avoid the political discussion, but it's not something that is just happening in Colombia, because the idea of using databases and complicated systems to select beneficiaries and to avoid this situation of going to communities, it is something that is completely part of the mindset of policymakers, that they basically try to avoid the political friction, no? And completely govern from the distance the situation of the communities. And can I ask if you like try to read again the last question, because it was really long, so I get a little bit lost.
Absolutely. And just to clarify, that monster database was a deliberate joke and not a mistake. So her question is, apart from Rita Kakira's question is, apart from the philosophical issue with the approach that was used, how confidently can it be said that this approach did not have exclusion errors? That the monster database combined with the exclusion criterion that were used were adequate to find everyone who needs support, that the data set included everyone, was complete, recorded people's actual information correctly.
Okay.
She's asking from the Indian perspective.
Okay, I cannot be, as I said, I'm not a data scientist kind of guy, but we could be just analyzing the data that they were collecting and connecting. It's for sure that we have problems. I think all countries, and Colombia is one of them, they have this kind of really high, big problems on their databases and collecting so many databases, and depending a lot, that's something that I didn't mention, and they depend a lot on financial institutions, on mobile providers, on financial risk assessment companies. So they depend a lot on private. So that's something that we need to take into account, that they have the mindset of profit as the main drive for that. So in that way, I cannot say directly, but I know some problems. The databases that they are using, those have definitely problems. Historically, they have problems. And the other thing is that, for example, because Sysben was in the process, the modernization of Sysben was happening at the same time of the pandemic. So they were like doing these interviews at the same time that the pandemic was happening. So the condition of the situation of the people, that they used to assess and to select people was before the pandemic. Could you imagine the changes of the situation of people after a economic crisis? It could be huge. And the other thing is that they were mixing and the data that they didn't have, they were trying to look for the old version of system. So they were like mixing people from older versions, new versions, and new versions that they were not updated in the middle of the pandemic. So the exclusion is clear. One of the clear exclusions is that they, for example, took the benefits or the money that people was earning before the pandemic as something to exclude them. So it's crazy that they were trying to select people and exclude people through something that was before the pandemic.
Like, we've still got quite a few minutes, and we have quite a few questions that kind of deal with the question of alternatives. You know, what can we do instead? And so we have Luz Rodriguez, who asks, what are the alternative solutions? What do you think should be the right approach to support low-income and vulnerable people? And then Rodolfo Beasley is asking, the fact that the algorithm operated as a sort of black box has been clearly explained, but it's not entirely clear what could have been an alternative for reaching 2.9 million people rapidly. The census swipes, usually undertaken by CISBEN, are slow, costly, and unfeasible in the context of social distancing and mobility restrictions that you've talked about. So the main issue there is lack of transparency, but what's an alternative mechanism in this context which actually engages communities? And then someone else has also asked about the potential ideal solution to providing pandemic payments in the future. Would this, you know, be a more public algorithm or a hybrid system of prediction and of political discourse? So the three sort of somewhat similar questions there about what could we do better?
I think that the first answer is to expand. No, definitely, 2.9 million. That's the main problem. Colombian population is 45 million. People is in 45% of the population is in poverty. So just 45%, and in vulnerability we have a lot of people. So it's for real, and it's clear that 2.9 million is not enough. That's the first thing. And the option that I think is feasible is to use at less data, the less data as possible, you know, because delivering fast, that is something that I really admire about the system, that just sending money to the poor is that's what the government needed to do. But the way in which was implemented was not the proper way, no? So basically, I think that using less data, expanding the shared social benefits, as I said, they already had databases to know at least how many people was in vulnerability conditions, but they decided to go for this so complicated system. And the other thing is that the need, they really think that the government really think that the communal way of thinking is corrupt and is a problem. So for example, in Colombia, we have the Juntas de Acción Comunal, or basically like communities that are organizing neighbors in municipalities, but they imagine that delivering that money and working with the communities is something that is problematic, is something that is corruption. So they definitely not think in having that kind of reliance on communities. So I think that if they expand it and they use it less data, and also that they consulted and created ways to create a direct dialogue with the communities and their institutions, because those institutions exist, people are organized. So that's something that in our work was really clear. We had the opportunity to work with a community in a small town in Colombia, and we realized that they are organized, they understand, they know each other's situations and necessities, and that's something that is really important. They know who needs more. But it's something that is not acceptable, because it's something about corruption and risk.
Thank you, Juan. I think we have time for perhaps two more questions. Bernadita says, writes, and this goes to the point about sort of the obfuscation effect. Couldn't an algorithm allow for more objective parameters instead of the system being tampered with for political purposes? So that's one question. And then related to the effect on local politics, Maria Parada Hernandez writes, do you think that the reforms change not only the possibility of the people to participate in the process, but also of the local authorities? Are the local authorities just mediators now to collect the data and nothing more? It's a great question.
That's a great question. About the algorithm, I don't know. I think I'm not the one to talk about like the good algorithm, but what we could say that is that there are possibilities to include these values and this human right perspective in the way in which systems are designed, and definitely this way that is that avoids any possibility to discuss and to have communities and also local authorities included. It's a perspective that definitely lose too much. So I think that they always and it is always a problem for a historian to know to say that the real and perfect algorithm is problematic, but definitely we have guidelines and we have constitutional and fundamental duties to fulfill. And about local authorities, completely agree. I think all the processes, that's something that I didn't mention because I didn't have the time, but SISBEN was also reformed to avoid that local authorities had access to the database. So basically to touch it. So basically they said that local authorities are corrupt and they are problematic. So in that way, they are really trying to not depend on local authorities, and we have local democracy. So basically all that people that is on municipalities was selected by democracies, and they are really trying to not having intermediaries. And that's something that connected with this less friction kind of mindset, that they think is better to not have political discussions and not negotiate with local authorities because they are corrupt, they are a problem, and not negotiate with communities also. So that's a clear mindset, and that's like the way they are thinking for the future of social protection. So not having any possibility to negotiate something. And I think data systems are amazing for that. Like if they are implemented in that way, they could be sure that people don't have the possibilities to discuss that.
Thanks so much, Juan. We could have talked about this for another hour, I think, and we've had some other amazing questions in the Q&A from our audience members, but unfortunately we're out of time. We're committed to keeping these conversations to an hour sharp, and we're already 2 minutes over, but I wanted to thank you so much for your time and your great insights. And also just to say that this is the sort of conversation that we had hoped for when we first started this series, a highly interesting case study, and then having audience members from across the world with various different kinds of expertise to ask questions and get involved. So I think this was a perfect session in so many ways. I just wanted to reiterate to our audience that the conversation has been recorded and will soon also be made available on our YouTube channel, and that allows you to see to watch it again, but also to share it or to use it in your teaching or in your advocacy. And once that recording is available, we will also publish a brief blog on our webpage in which we summarize today's conversation, and in which we will also highlight some of the work that Juan has done and other resources that are relevant to understand the situation in Colombia. Thanks again, Juan, and to our audience members, we look forward to see you again in the new year when we will continue with this series. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, everyone.